And when they cut the phone lines, these were completely severed, and they hit the shielding outside the fiber.
That's not good.
And when they finally pulled their stupid backhoe out of the ground, we've kind of got like the shielding part here on the fiber, and then the fiber was out here, and it was like this. And there was the shielding going the other way. That's what it looked like inside the dirt. The fiber was in an S shape.
That's not going to work very well.
Okay.
Quest fixed it, or CenturyLink fixed it, and we were never down. It didn't take us down.
That's impressive.
That's amazing.
I'm wondering if some pairs, fiber pairs, did break, but ours was just lucky.
Yeah, you're probably just lucky.
And I don't know if they actually fixed any of it, or if they just kind of went,
It's working.
yeah. We'll take care of the broken pairs when we need them. But for that, for the guy down the road who needs those pairs later.
No, that's probably you did.
Yeah, we were, exactly. It
Cut
will.
the whole thing.
It probably will.
Resplice it.
They will have to resplice it, yes.
We are live now.
So that's fine. Okay, cool. Database replication. Setup, care and feeding, tips and tricks. Pretty simple stuff. If I can get this to work. There we go. Who's this guy? It's this guy. Right.
I thought that was your evil twin.
You can hardly read that, but computer nerd since I was about age 6. Had a VIC 20, Commodore 64, Commodore 128. Those were my first computers. I never really got into the consoles. I always had like actual computer computers. Yeah. Usually people had like Ataris and Activisions and that kind of stuff. But, first PC was a Gateway 2000, 486, 66, VX2, blazing fast, 66 megahertz of raw power. And I had a little turbo button, which was slow my ass down, right? Because when the turbo button was on, it was at 66 megahertz, and when the turbo button was off, it was at 33. Why they did that, I don't know. So I was dual booting that into a 0.9 kernel of Linux, and then also had DOS 5 and Windows 3.1. It was about 1991-92 era. Installing from floppy disks sucked. 3.5-inch floppies, okay. In a pack of 10, you're always pretty much guaranteed that 1 out of those 10 was bad.
And it wasn't, wait about a week.
And you didn't find out about it until after you had written to it
And then try to repeat.
and got about 3 disks into an install, and you tried to do that 4th disk. You hit that 4th disk, and you're like, you're GG, 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 and you're like, and you run out to buy more disks. Because you only bought the 10 pack because that's all you needed. First IT job, I was a part-time desk support at Farmland Industries, which had an office here in Des Moines. It was like a regional office. Basically had token ring network, IBM microchannel desktop systems, and then their infrastructure was all based off of Novell NetWare, which I didn't get to play with because I was just the desktop. I don't get to play with the desktops. Current job, as I said earlier, writestufanime.com, basically sysadministration, virtual janitor, VMware stuff. Horizon View, we do thin clients with desktops, or thin clients with virtual desktops. We got some Linux boxes and Active Directory and all that fun stuff. All right, my assumptions. We all know what this means, right? I'm assuming a lot. Then we'll go over initial setup. Basically just going to do a two server config. Replication setup, how to set up replication. Care and feeding, monitoring and backup. Just some hints and tips on how to do that or how to use replication to do that. Some other miscellaneous tips and tricks. And then resources, stuff I used to find this stuff out and make the presentation. My assumptions. You know how to install and configure some flavor of Linux. You know how to install packages on that. You know how to modify a firewall. You know how to deal with SE Linux. You understand basic SQL syntax, like you know how to select. Hopefully, you do. I'm going to use MySQL, the Community Edition. Of course, you know Oracle, but not MySQL. So, yeah, there's that possibility that it might not be around forever. This should work with MariaDB because they're supposed to be feature compatible at this point. In the future, that might diverge, but right now, you should be able to use either one. You are breathing and you have a pulse. Do I need to go around and check? No? You can check yourself. Thank you. Initial setup, you'll need 2 DB servers. You need someplace to be the primary and someplace to be the replication. Designate one as the master and the slave, obviously. Then you'll need to get the required packages. Basically, you do an apt-get type install. There's usually like a meta package that you can install that installs all the stuff you need for databases. But if you're doing anything like a LAMP server or anything else, you want to get all those packages too. Apache, PHP, whatever you're using. I'm not going to go over configuring and establishing databases on the master server. I'm going to assume you know how to do that. Basically, you need data to replicate, right? You need something running on the primary server that you want to get to the replica server. So that's what that covers. So we're going to assume that you already have that. The next step would be once you have basically you're going to set up the primary server first and get whatever services and data you need running on that first. Then, once that's all configured and running the way you want it, with all the options you need to run that database server, so let's say you're just doing a basic database-backed web server, you know, all the things are working, all the pieces and parts are running as you like them, then you think about replication. So the configuration of that main database server will be pretty much copied over to the replica, the slave server. You're not going to move the data yet. Just going to get them so that they're configured the same as if you were going to use the slave to become the new master, as if you were going to host the data on that. And then, of course, make sure that you take care of any firewall or SE Linux stuff. You know, the 2 servers need to be able to talk to each other. Any SE Linux type and firewall type problems you ran into on the master while you were setting it up, you're probably going to have to take care of those on the slave when you set it up. And then there's the regular standard, I think it's 3306. I've got it on a later slide. TCP port 3306. You need to be able to talk from the slave to the master, not necessarily the other way around. All right. Replication setup. The my.cnf file on both servers is what you're going to need to modify. On the master server, it needs to have a server ID of 1, and you need to turn on or enable binary logging. And what that log-bin directive does is basically tell what the prefix to all the binary log files is going to be, what the name of the binary log file is. The master typically is always going to be server ID 1, and then I usually do the slave as 2, 3, 4, whatever. It doesn't matter. And it says in the fine print, the my.cnf file may be in a different location depending on your distribution. MySQLD section, you see that right there, is what establishes that as a server config. There's also a client section for client stuff, which we'll actually touch on a little bit later. Yeah, the log bin establishes binary logging, server ID 1. Slave will be server ID 2, and you will leave out the binary logging on the slave. You'll use that on the slave server.
So is there any meaning to the server ID other than they have to be unique and one is
The primary thing is that they have to be unique. I don't think the master has to be one, because you can do multi-master and you can have, you know, we'll see later, you can get crazy even in ways that you probably shouldn't. But, you know, server ID 2 can be the master for another server. So they just need to be unique. They don't need to be, there's no meaning to the number except that you can't have 2 with server ID 1. And of course, you have to restart the service to reload that config. All right. The next step is to back up the master server data. So you've already got it humming along. You've got your web services or whatever running, and you're putting data into the database, pulling data out of the database, reading it, writing it, whatever. You need to get a copy of that data in its current state, copied over to the slave before we can start replication. You're kind of bootstrapping it, kickstarting it. You can't just turn on replication and have everything just go over. You have to start with a baseline. And the way you do that is with MySQL dump. And basically, I just go through what each of the command line options here means. You can give a username and password on the command line, or those can also be configured in a my.cnf file so that you don't have to give them on the command line. And you can script those. A lot easier if it's in your my.cnf. You can actually do MySQL dump and MySQL commands in kind of a more protected manner by protecting that file. The minus capital A basically says grab everything. Capital A for all. And then the add drop database is basically just kind of a fail-safe in case there are databases on the slave server from a previous failed attempt or leftover stuff. So if you've got a foo database on the master and there's some sort of foo database on the slave that's in some weird state from a failed attempt previous time, that add drop database will save your butt because it drops the databases before it restores the backup on the other side. And you can't really do that after the fact very easily. But I'm aware of it anyway. And then I pipe it through gzip. I use the -1 because I found that it compresses a lot, and there's not a huge benefit as far as time is concerned if you use a higher compression level. So there's a lot of white space and whatnot in a MySQL dump file, so it's pretty easy to compress. And the difference between the time difference between a -1, which is the quickest compression, and a -9 is actually kind of large. And the larger your database gets, that's going to be a larger amount of time. And you're not going to see a big benefit in the amount of space that saves. So trading off time for space, I use gzip1. Because it's quick and it compresses it enough that if you had a huge database, you know, it's not going to be as onerous to get over to the other server, which is Did I skip one? No, I didn't rsync, did I? Oh, not yet. Okay. On the master server, very shortly after you've grabbed this backup, right? So you have that master backup.sql.gz file sitting on the master server right now. You've probably started copying it over to the slave. The first thing you want to do after grabbing that is grab the master status. You turn on binary logging, and that binary log is what the replication process uses to find the position in the transaction log that it needs to start from when it starts the replication to the slave server. So these binary logs are kind of like the transaction logs on a Microsoft SQL database. So you need to record that log position so that when you start replication, you've got your restored data. This has been chugging away, adding stuff in. All these transactions have happened after that point. This binary log position tells the replication where to start catching up to the master server. What we're interested in from them, and this will be run on the master server, is the file and position, which I've tried to highlight there. I think it shows up pretty good. So the file name and the position are what we're interested in, because we're going to need both to start the replication on the slave. If you have multiple files listed, you're only really interested in the last one or the highest numbered one and its position. So these will usually be sequentially numbered. You'll see a bunch of them if there's been a lot of activity. You'll want the highest numbered file and then whatever the position number is next to that file, regardless of what that number is. You can also use the command show binary logs. It basically shows the same outfit. There, so not nice. And really, yeah.
Are these numbers at the time you'd make the backup?
Yeah, typically what I would probably do is,
Not like an hour later, but
yeah, do like a semicolon after this, and then issue that command to the SQL server to get that like right after. I've not really done this with databases that were like super high traffic, so it has always been, in my experience, efficient just to grab that right after the dump finishes. If it was a super high traffic database, that timing might be a little more critical. You might need to make sure that you grab it immediately after the dump finishes so that you have that position.
Setting up replication while live in a heavy production environment, that's living on the edge, man.
Yeah, it is. Okay. So on the master server, you need to create a user, just like you would any other database user. But this one would be dedicated to replication. This is the user that the slave server is going to use to log in to the master and start the replication. So it needs to authenticate in MySQL as a regular database user would that was connected to just a database. The special stuff about this is that it does say grant replication, which is a special right that's different than like you would grant to like a web application that was only accessing one database. The replication is a read-only type permission, but it basically lets the thing read everything. Username at slave host, identified by, and the password. Pretty simple, pretty standard. The caveats here are the username for the grant should be dedicated to replication only. And as it says in the MySQL 5.7 manual, you should be aware that the replication user name and password are stored in plain text in the master info repository file or table. So they're in the database in clear text. That could have security implications. just be aware of it. Okay. Technically, you probably should have started this earlier, especially if you had a large database. Because this might take a little while. You have a lot of data to move over. But basically, this is just an standard rsync command to get that master backup SQL file from the master over to the slave. And I like those options. Archive preserves all the file attributes and permissions. Capital P is a combo of partial and progress. That means if the file transfer gets interrupted and you restart this command, it should pick up where it left off instead of starting from the beginning again. It can come in handy with large files. And verbose, because I like to see what's going on. Standard rsync. Then when you're back on the slave's side, the file transfer is completed, you want to unzip that file and type it through MySQL with a user that has full rights to that slave. It doesn't have to be the same user rights as on the master, but it could be. You know, usually that's like root. You need a different user if you want. It just has to have, you know, full rights to all tables and databases on that server. And the -C option sends the output to standard out. Yeah, so you're piping this straight into that. So basically, it's just going to spew out the plain text MySQL commands as if it was a huge MySQL script that you're sending into the MySQL command here. And that builds that copy of that database on the slave that you backed up from the master. Once all the data is there, you need to actually establish the replication. This is where you're going to need the replication username and replication password that you created on the master, that special replication user. And you're also going to need the binary log file name, which we grabbed from the master shortly after performing the MySQL dump, and that log position. And then once you have those in, this used to be actually in the myCNF file. We used to set these in the myCNF file in older versions of MySQL. Now you set them in the actual database. So these are in the database. I think they're in the master table, which is why it says this is in plain text in that table. Because it is. You just put it there. Then we do.
Not every user can read the master table.
Exactly. You need to make sure that your security is set up so that people can't access that table that shouldn't. Because then they might be able to do things they shouldn't be able to do with your master. One weird thing I found here is that the master log position is the only value of these values that should not be enclosed in single quotes. The number. But sometimes config files have those in single quotes too. So just be aware. I think in the actual myCNF file, when it was in the plain text file, that was single quoted. Or it didn't matter, you can do it either way. These require single quotes. This one won't work if you put it in single quotes. Whereas in the old style config file, it used to work either way. So that last command, start slave, should have started replication, but how do you know? You need to verify it. So the show slave status command with the /G to make it more human-friendly readable, and it just puts everything on a line with a key value syntax. It's huge. There's lots of output from that. What you're interested in are just these things right here. If your replication was started successfully and your binary log positions all matched up and everything's happy, you should see waiting for master to send event, slave RO running, slave SQL running, last error 0, no errors, please. Or last error number 0. Last error would be a text string. If there was a value here, you'd see a text string describing the error that it got. So that should be blank. And then seconds behind master. That may not necessarily be 0, depending on how much time has passed between the time you took your MySQL dump on the master server and grabbed that binary log position and when you actually ran that start slave command. How much time passed and how busy your database is, that could be gigabytes of data if you have a really busy database. So seconds behind master might be a number that should be counting down. So if you run this show slave status a few times in a row, maybe 10, 15 seconds apart, hopefully that seconds behind master number is decrementing and approaching 0. Master better, but it'll get there eventually. One thing I like to do is I like to make a change in the database, especially once you reach 0 here. Make a change in the database and just double check that it made it to the other side. A little sanity check. You know, pick a table and a value that doesn't matter, or insert into a table that won't break something, and see if that insert actually happened on the slave. Don't have to, but. Or if you know you can do something in your web application that will make a change that you can monitor in your database, and it's a legitimate change that you need to make anyway, look for that. So you don't have less risk of breaking things. This is basically the same as verifying, except you can shove this into a script. So you could run regular checks to see if your replication is running in, let's say, a cron tab job, and report back or send an email out, hey, I checked replication, everything's great. Or, hey, I checked replication and seconds behind master is not 0. You might want to look at that. I have a script based off of this that I run on my slave servers that it doesn't run all the time. I think it runs like once a day, and it will email me every day. Replication's good. Replication stopped. Uh-oh. Okay, backing up using the slave host. So one strategy in doing this is that you don't want to stop your main database from running to do a backup. And you do want to stop the databases to do a backup, so that the data is kind of static when you're doing your MySQL dump, and you don't have to rely on all the locks and whatnot happening. You know, that can slow down performance on your main server too, when it's doing a MySQL dump and trying to service web app requests, right? So one of the strategies is your main server continues to serve whatever applications it's taken care of. You use the slave to do your backups. So what I do is I have scripts that run and they stop the slave. They verify that the slave actually did stop. I want to make sure. Then I'll run the backup, which is basically the same as the backup we did on the master right at the beginning of this. And then, you know, obviously check the output from that to make sure it was successful. And then do the start slave at the end, catch up. And that keeps that extra server load from happening on your master server. And your slave server can take care of that backup and focus on backing that data up with no data incoming from the from the master. Speeds up your backup a little bit, and kind of gives you a sort of static view of the database because it's at rest at that point. You know, you may have stopped replication in the middle of a large transaction queue, but that slave is now not servicing any incoming data from the master at all. So it can put all its resources towards dumping that data. Move your data only once. So I have not tested this, but I don't like moving things more than once. I don't have. This is a way to take that initial MySQL dump and restore it onto the slave with one command. So you don't have to do the rsync in the middle. You have to wait for the data to dump from the main server, then take that file, transfer it over, because basically you're moving it from the tables to a file, then you're moving that file to another file on the slave, and then you're moving that file from the slave. That's what, 3 moves? With this, it goes straight from the tables on the master straight into the databases on the slave. 1 move. If it works.
Yeah, the risk I could see with that is it's far less fault tolerant than rsync is.
Definitely, definitely. But if you're doing the add drop database, it gets interrupted, you start over from the beginning. There's no, there's no pickup where you left off kind of thing. But with the add drop database, you're not going to munge up the data on the slave side if you restart it. So it's a risk you do take with that. And I've never seen this syntax before where you use the space between those. But supposedly that is similar to a pipe. Like I said, I've not tried it. All right. Basically, dealing with the firewall, the master needs to allow incoming connections from the slave on port 306, and that's it. That's all the slave needs. And the master doesn't need to be able to talk to the slave at all. So you don't need to have any access going the other way. The slave connects as if it's a regular client with the replication authentication that you set up and does its thing. SE Linux. We love SE Linux, don't we? No? Really? These are the standard kind of general tips with SE Linux for anything, but I'll just go over them here. You use set enforce permissive. That can help you verify that SE Linux actually is the problem or not. Because if you use SE Linux or set enforce permissive and it still doesn't work, SE Linux isn't stopping it. Something else is broken. Set enforce permissive will actually still log the faults that SE Linux would have stopped, so you can use the output from those log files and the little utility called audit to allow to fix those problems. And then you do set enforce. Is it enforcing? Set enforce enforcing, I think is what it is. Or set enforce enable. Might be enabled. Yeah, most of the time, if you change the context of the affected file locations, using SE Manage, that will fix your problems. So you may not even need to use audit to allow to make changes. Sometimes it's just the directory structure where your distribution put those database files, or if you did some custom things and you put your database files in a non-standard location, let's say, the standard location was under var data or something, and you moved it to a mount point somewhere else, that might break your database and not let it go because that other mount point is not labeled properly under the proper context for SE Linux. So you'd have to relabel that file structure and make that a permanent change. And then SE Linux will say, okay, database files are fine in that location. They weren't before. Change context is temporary. A file system relabel or restore con operation will revert your changes. So you need to use SE Manage to make any changes to contexts permanent. High-level SE Linux stuff beyond the scope of this presentation. Okay, now we get the fun stuff. How would you use replication? What are some good ideas? What are some bad ideas? So, daisy chain replication. So you got your master server here. You got a slave here. You got another slave here. Maybe another slave. Dot, 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 dot. So you get the end slave. Also known as the SQL centipede or trickle-down replication. It's better to configure multiple slaves from one master than to have a long chain of slave after slave after slave. So instead of doing that, do this, if you must. But it's still probably not a great idea. Two-way replication. Oh, that's lovely. This is a horrible idea, and we were doing it. So this becomes a master, and this becomes a slave. And you're literally putting the data back in to the master that you just took it out of. Who is our master now? And your data goes both ways. Not a good idea. You need to use proper failover and failback procedures instead. Oftentimes what people are doing this for is they're thinking, oh, I'm going to have a problem with master, I'm going to have to make this the master temporarily, and then when I fix this guy, well, I've got replication already set up. I just have to flip the switch. There's a process for switching between masters, and it is documented. Follow that procedure. Bad idea. Don't do it. Circular replication, even better. Also known as circle of death or the SQL jerk. Obviously. Very bad. This is an attempt to do proper clustering. It's not a substitute for clustering. There's a whole separate infrastructure in MySQL and MariaDB for doing proper clusters. And you want to use that, not this. This is not a viable substitute for proper clustering. And that's it. Wait, resources. There we go. I double tap that. Resources. Basically the manual, published by Oracle. Searchable on their site. And they go back versions too. So if you're running an older version, use the one appropriate to your version because they did change stuff. I actually recently went from a MySQL 5.1 environment to a 5.7. And I had to upgrade 5.1 to 5.2 or 3, and then went from 3 to 4, and then 4 to 5, because each step of the way, there were problems that I had to solve because of the changing configuration and changing things that they just did differently. And I tried going straight from 5.1 to 5.7. It just did not work. So I started doing the step through all the different versions until I got it up to 5.7. But that's what we're running now is 5.7. In the manual online, there is a whole section on replication solutions with pretty diagrams about what you can do. One of the use cases, which kind of goes against the don't do a chain recommendation, was to do, let's say you had a high volume server, high volume master, very busy all the time, but you wanted to send the data to multiple slaves. What they suggested, instead of putting all that replication load on the master, what they suggested was go to a single slave and then have your multiple slaves go off of this. So it's kind of a chain a little bit, which was not recommended, but it keeps this guy from having to serve 10, 15, 20 slaves if you have a bunch. You can also selectively pick which DBs. So DB1 might go to this. DB2 might go to this slave. So you might have different slaves for different databases if you wanted to split it out that way. One reason might be maybe these are on different backup schedules. You want to be able to back up this one more frequently while keeping the replication going into these, or stagger your backups so they're not all backing up at the same time, that kind of thing. And that's just to get the load off of the master and keep it from. And you can also do multi-master. So you can have, DB1 and then 2 and 3 on those servers. That kind of stuff is gone into detail in the replication solutions. End user guides for password security, that's where that warning about the plain text replication password came from. But there's also some good stuff in there about just using the my.cnf file and just general security best practices. And then I put a couple of books in there from O'Reilly that just have a bunch of tips and tricks beyond the scope of replication, just stuff to look at. That's it. All done. Any other questions? Good call. New record, huh?
Actually, pretty much right on time.
Right on time?
Since we really don't have a hard, fast drop dead time, we're always on time.
Yeah.
So thank you once again. You wasted another Wednesday night.
Yeah.
Talking about Linux.
No, it's not. Dev Norton's really Dev Random.
In the car talk NPR sort of way of wasting an hour. So we've sort of hit there for a while. We had a list of prepared topics and people who had volunteered to present stuff. Well, we've now reached the end of that list. So again, sort of going with the NPR theme, this is a point where we ask, what do you guys want to talk about next? Possibilities. I know there's been some chatter on the IRC/Slack channel about Nginx and like reverse proxying sort of stuff. Consider themselves an expert in that. Otherwise, I can muddle through it, and it can be a beginner's guide to it. For next month, we'll most likely be back here again, unless we get told that we're not able to, or
Someone comes up with a better.
someone else has a better location, and or if the makerspace ever figures out
I think
where.
the Forge would take us on, probably.
What's that?
The Forge would probably take us on.
Yeah, we could.
Sometimes they give us free food if we go there.
We could do that as a Christmas holiday special. Possibly, I'll email them. It's been a while since they've come trying to hire me away. So that,
They hired somebody else that's going to them with LinkedIn that's starting, so we have fresh meat.
but I know there are a few fairly new faces here, and then some somewhat new back again to us faces. So if you are new, welcome. If you are old, welcome anyway. You haven't learned yet, obviously. We'll announce where and when and how as normal on the email listserv, as well as several different tech places around the Des Moines area, including LinkedIn and junk like that. And if you have any thoughts of where to post and to track people, feel free to speak up as well.
The Java users group has started using Meetup.
And anyone who's willing to sponsor us to foot the bill for that, I'm all ears for that. But until then, either we need a corporate sponsorship or dues or something in order to cover that.
Java user group has.
Yeah.
Which anyone whose corporation is willing to throw money at us. Unfortunately, we're currently not a 501c
Whatever.
org, just because the paperwork for benefit was
Well, it
non-existent,
requires
but-
things like bylaws, which we pretty much abolished,
Yeah,
and officers, which despot, right? So.
but if you guys do want to learn, they say the best way of learning how to learn something is by presenting. So if anyone wants to present something about free and open source software that they feel strongly about, we're a fairly friendly spot to present at. Really, kind of. We're only moderately hostile at most times. But
On the mailing
otherwise,
list, is everyone on the mailing list
Yeah.
here, if you're not aware of it?
I'll get the digest.
Okay.
okay.
Good.
We do also have an IRC channel / Slack, and there's a bridge in between them, so you don't have to do both. There has been some mild grumblings here and there. I get it. That's where pretty much I leave it in y'all's hands of if people decide, no, we don't want the bridge,
Just burn it.
we can always burn it. Or if there's some other communication medium that you'd rather use than Slack or IRC, we'll try our best to accommodate you. But
Yeah.
it
The
is,
advantage of both is that they're both free.
one is less free
Than
in
the other.
beer,
Yeah.
but or in freedom instead of beer. But oh well. So that, speaking of that, that sort of leads into the after special interest group study. I know there was some talk on the IRC channel about desiring beverages that may have a ABV attached to them. That feel free to not be drinking said alcoholic things. Most places we choose do have water and or caffeinated beverages if that's your forte as well. So with that, I'm entertaining thoughts of where we want to go.
I like fogs, but that's me.
Okay,
What's the fronts?
I hear a motion for Fongs and no one's arguing, so
There's two different.
There we
fronts.
go.
Which one are you referring
The
to?
one closest to us right now.
Yes.
Please.
nobody wants to go downtown right now,
Fongs Ankeny.
unless you live down there.
Well, it does, but he's got a bias.
No, actually, more practical. I just want to see if you're, I just want to see if your logic was running on all tri-state